Daniel Mercer stood at the center of the courtroom, the mop still gripped in his hand, as silence settled over the room. No one there could have guessed that this quiet moment would mark the start of exposing one of the darkest corporate scandals in American history. Before we dive into this powerful story of justice, courage, and redemption, drop a comment to tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe that everyone, whether a billionaire or a janitor, deserves fair treatment under the law, make sure to like and subscribe. Stories about unsung heroes like Daniel deserve to be heard, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's look at what drove a once-forgotten legal prodigy to stand up against the very system that had destroyed his life. But before everything began to change, what do you think made Daniel, a man who had lost nearly everything, step out of the shadows? At that exact moment, the fall sunlight in New York streamed through the tall windows of the Southern District Courthouse, casting thin bands of light across the marble floor. Daniel had just finished mopping. It was 5 in the morning, just like every other day for the past 15 years, and he was already there. A 45-year-old man with brown hair streaked with gray and steady dark eyes, dressed in a Navy work uniform with maintenance stitched on the chest pocket. His small apartment in Astoria was still dark when he left at 4 a.m. The room held only a single bed, a small stove, and a bare wall decorated with one wedding photo of him and Rebecca from 17 years ago, before cancer took her away. Beside it sat a picture of their daughter Hannah, now 20, and in her last year of college. In the photo, she was 5, smiling in her mother's arms. Daniel didn't turn on the lights when he left home. Winter electricity bills were high, and with a paycheck of $2,800 a month, every cent counted. Breakfast was black coffee toast, and whatever food he packed from the courthouse cafeteria downstairs, a small perk for maintenance staff. That morning, as he pushed his cleaning cart down the third-floor hallway, Daniel stopped outside courtroom 302, the place where the city's biggest cases were tried. And today, one of the most talked-about trials in New York's history was about to begin. The lawsuit against Victoria Hale, a tech billionaire worth $14 billion. He hadn't heard about the case from the news. He didn't own a TV, but from the nights he spent cleaning that same courtroom. He'd seen the polished lawyers, overheard their careless conversations when they thought no one was listening. To them, the janitor was an invisible part of the furniture. But Daniel hadn't always been invisible. 15 years ago, he had been one of the rising stars at Harrington and Cole, a top Manhattan law firm. He once had a corner office with a view of Central Park, a flawless record of never losing a major case, and a future most lawyers could only dream of until it all came crashing down. He pushed those memories aside. That life was gone. Now he spent his days mopping floors, polishing benches, and taking out the trash, an honest job that paid the bills and let him send a little money to Hannah, even though she always turned it down. As Daniel was about to leave the courtroom, his phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor. Mercer Room 302 needs another cleaning. VIP today. Daniel let out a quiet breath. VIP meant pressure inspections and plenty of chances to get scolded for the tiniest mistake. Still, as always, he didn't complain. By 9 o'clock, the courtroom was filled. Reporters jostled for space, lawyers straightened their ties, and the sound of rapid typing echoed through the room. At the defense table sat Victoria Hale. She was 38, but her expression carried the exhaustion of someone twice her age. Her sharp blue eyes had dulled, and though her Armani suit was perfect, the tension in her hunched shoulders and clenched hands betrayed the fear she tried to hide. Beside her sat 6 empty chairs reserved for her legal team from Bennett Shaw and Pierce, the priciest firm in New York, billing $6,000 an hour. But they never showed. Daniel glanced at the clock. 9, he'll stay a while. Behind 15. The trial would start in 15 minutes. Victoria kept calling, and each time she hung up, her face grew paler. He could tell they weren't coming. They had abandoned her. All rise, the bailiff announced. Judge Eleanor Briggs entered stern and composed. Her eyes stopped on the empty seats. "Where is your legal team?" she asked. Victoria stood trying to stay calm, but her voice trembled. "I don't know, Your Honor. They were here yesterday. I've tried contacting them all morning, but no one's answered." Prosecutor Rachel Monroe rose, a thin, triumphant smile crossing her face. Your Honor, it's clear the defense has been abandoned. We move for a default judgment. Murmurs filled the room as reporters typed furiously. Judge Briggs sighed. If you have no legal counsel, the court cannot delay indefinitely. I am forced to. I will protect her. The deep, steady voice cut through the noise like thunder. Everyone turned. Daniel Mercer stood beside his cleaning cart mop still in hand. The light caught his graying hair, and the lines carved by 15 years of quiet endurance now sharpened by resolve. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, soft at first, then louder, but he didn't flinch. He set the mop down and walked toward the front. 2 decades of mopping floors hadn't erased the bearing of a lawyer who once commanded this very room. Judge Briggs lifted an eyebrow. "Who are you, Daniel Mercer?" "Your Honor, I'd like to represent Ms. Hale." Rachel Monroe let out a scoffing laugh. "A janitor wants to be a lawyer." Daniel met her gaze. "I was a member of the New York Bar Association for 18 years. A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. Daniel pulled out his worn wallet and took out an old license. Still valid. The judge examined it, her expression tightening. "Mr. Mercer, how long has it been since you practiced? 15 years, Your Honor." The air grew tense. "And you believe you're still competent?" she asked. "Your Honor, this woman deserves to be defended. I know the law, I know procedure, and I understand what justice means." Victoria stood and met his eyes, finding not desperation or ego, but sincerity, the kind no high-priced lawyer could fake. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I accept, Mr. Mercer." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Briggs rubbed her temples. "You have 15 minutes to confer with your client, and do not delay the proceedings." Daniel moved toward the defense table, but was stopped by security. "Sorry, only attorneys allowed in this area." He handed over his card, and after the judge nodded, the guard stepped aside awkwardly. Sitting down, Daniel could feel every pair of eyes on him, but he looked only at Victoria. "Something's very wrong here," he whispered. "This isn't just about your lawyers walking out, it's orchestrated." "How do you know?" she whispered back. "Because I've seen thousands of cases in the last 15 years. This one isn't normal, so who's behind it? We'll find out. But first, I need to hear everything." Victoria looked at the man she had walked past countless times without noticing the man who had stood up for her when no one else did. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe she had finally found the right person. The 15 minutes felt like 15 seconds as Victoria spoke quickly, trying to condense 3 months of preparation into an emergency briefing. She explained her breakthrough, a quantum processor that functioned at room temperature, a discovery capable of transforming everything from computing to energy production. She told him about Vertex Dynamics, the company accusing her of stealing their technology, and described the chaos that followed: collapsing stock prices, media frenzy, business partners disappearing. Daniel listened without taking notes. He didn't just hear her words. He caught the pauses, the tremor in her voice, the certainty when she spoke about her invention. His steady eyes never left her face. She realized he wasn't just listening, he was reading her. The tension, the hesitations, the truth between her words. "Time's up," the clerk called out. Judge Briggs struck the gavel. "Mr. Mercer, prepare for your opening statement." Daniel rose and walked to the podium, feeling every gaze on him, some skeptical, some curious, others openly dismissive. How many years had it been since he last stood here? How many nights had he lain awake in his small apartment in Astoria, imagining a moment like this, only to wake up again with a mop in his hand? He rested his palm on the podium, feeling the smooth grain of the wood beneath his touch. Taking a slow breath, Daniel lifted his head and looked directly at the 12 faces in the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his tone steady and clear. "My name is Daniel Mercer. First, I want to apologize for how I look. I'm not wearing an expensive suit like my colleague across the aisle. I don't have a big office or a team of assistants. Less than an hour ago, I was still mopping the floor of this very courtroom." Soft laughter rippled from the back, but Daniel didn't waver. "For 15 years, I've been in this room almost every day watching justice unfold. I've seen truth rise, and I've seen truth buried. And I've learned that justice isn't about how much your lawyer charges or which firm's name is on your paperwork. It's about something simpler: truth. He paused, letting the silence draw tight. And the truth in this case is simple. Victoria Hale stole nothing. She created a groundbreaking technology through her own intelligence, hard work, and determination. Meanwhile, those who seek to take that creation from her are using the law as a weapon. Objection, Rachel Monroe snapped, standing abruptly. He's arguing, not presenting an opening statement, sustained Judge Briggs replied. Mr. Mercer, keep your comments factual. Daniel nodded. My apologies, Your Honor. I'll let the evidence speak for itself, and I'll make you one promise: by the end of this trial, it will be crystal clear who's telling the truth and who isn't. He sat down. His words weren't polished, nor were they rehearsed, but they were genuine. And from the small, quiet nods among the jury, Daniel knew at least a few of them were truly listening. Rachel Monroe stood tall and composed, her movements sharp and deliberate. She approached the podium like it belonged to her. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began smoothly, her voice cool and confident. This case isn't nearly as complex as the defense would have you believe. It's actually quite simple. This is theft. She let her eyes sweep slowly across the jurors. Victoria Hale stole proprietary inventions from Vertex Dynamics, a company that invested hundreds of millions in developing quantum computing technology. She used her influence to gain access to internal research, copied the designs, and filed for patents under her own name. Rachel paused just long enough for the accusation to sink in. We will prove this with documents, expert witnesses, and testimony from her own former employees. By the end of this trial, there will be no doubt Victoria Hale is a thief, and thieves must be held accountable. She sat down with the calm assurance of someone convinced victory was already hers. The rest of the morning drifted by like a hazy nightmare. The prosecution called its first witness, a tech analyst, who claimed Victoria's design was far too similar to Vertex's internal files to be coincidence. When it came time for cross-examination, Daniel rose, every muscle in his body tightening. 15 years since he'd last done this, 15 years since he'd stood before a witness, dissecting details one by one, searching for the smallest cracks that could unravel the whole story. But when he spoke, something unexpected happened. The words came back naturally, the rhythm familiar, the questions flowing one into another, as if he'd never left the courtroom. He led the witness through overlapping details, conflicting timelines, and technical data the witness claimed to have seen but couldn't have reasonably accessed. As the contradictions surfaced, Daniel felt something stir inside him, something he'd buried long ago. The man he once was, a lawyer. By the end of the session, Judge Briggs regarded Daniel differently, her expression carrying a faint trace of reluctant respect. Mr. Mercer, she said you might want a proper suit for tomorrow. Daniel nodded. I'll take care of it, Your Honor. But as he left the courtroom, he knew the truth. He couldn't afford a new suit. The only one he owned had been gathering dust in his closet for more than a decade, and now hung loosely after years of physical labor. Victoria caught up with him in the hallway. Mr. Mercer, she called out. He turned. This time he didn't see a billionaire or a high-profile client, just a woman holding on to her last bit of hope. She was taller than he expected, her posture radiating the kind of confidence money could buy. Yet fear lingered in her sharp blue eyes, something wealth couldn't conceal. Thank you, she said softly. I don't know why you're doing all this, but thank you. Daniel shook his head. Don't thank me yet. We've barely started. And we need to talk seriously. I need every document connected to this case, emails, notes, blueprints. If we're going to fight, I have to know everything. Victoria nodded. Come to my place tonight. I keep everything there. I can't, Daniel said. I have a work shift tonight. She frowned. A shift? But you're my lawyer. And I'm also a janitor who needs to pay rent, Daniel replied evenly. The court isn't paying me to defend you, Ms. Hale. This is pro bono, which means I still have to work if I don't want to lose my job. For the first time, Victoria truly grasped the distance between their worlds. For her, paying $6,000 an hour for legal counsel once felt normal. For this man, missing one shift could mean not covering the rent. I'll pay you, she said quickly. No, Daniel replied firmly. If this were about money, I wouldn't be here. I'm not doing this for recognition or reward. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. He paused, his tone softening. But I'll come after my shift. Is midnight too late for you? Midnight is perfect, Victoria said. And somewhere deep down, both of them knew the real fight was only beginning. At midnight, Daniel parked his old Toyota outside Victoria's mansion gate, still wearing his janitor uniform that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals from his 8-hour shift. He hadn't had time to go home or change, and the truth showed in every dried sweat mark on his shirt. This time the gate guard had been told to expect him, though the look the man gave his car said it all: he didn't belong here. As he stepped through the main entrance, another security guard escorted him, not to help, but to make sure he didn't wander off into restricted areas. Victoria waited in her office, still dressed in the suit she'd worn into court, minus the jacket. She looked drained in a way rest couldn't fix. Coffee, she asked. This time Daniel nodded. He needed it to stay sharp. She poured him a cup from an espresso machine that probably cost more than his monthly rent. The taste was rich, smooth, and worlds apart from the instant coffee he drank every morning. All right, Daniel said, setting the cup down. Tell me the real story. Not the version you told your lawyers, not what you told the press. The truth. Victoria sat down, staring into her cup, like it might hold the answers she'd avoided facing. I started Quantum Core 12 years ago, she said, her voice soft as the memories pulled her back. Back then, I was just an MIT grad obsessed with quantum computing. Everyone said stable quantum processing at room temperature was impossible. Qubits collapsed too fast. They said only multi-million-dollar labs with extreme cooling could even get close. Her eyes brightened as she spoke, and for the first time, Daniel saw the woman behind the armor of wealth and reputation. But I had an idea. What if instead of fighting the decay, we used it? What if the instability itself became part of the computation? She gave a small laugh, unsure if it was pride or irony. They called me crazy. My professor said I was wasting my time. But you proved them wrong, Daniel said. Victoria nodded slightly. 6 years working in a tiny department, living on student loans, no funding, no lab, just me and my laptop. She stood, opened a safe hidden behind a painting, and pulled out a thin folder. Here, she said, handing it to him. All my original research notes, dated, notarized, everything. Proof that I developed this tech long before Vertex even existed. Daniel opened the folder. Inside were hundreds of pages of equations, diagrams, and handwritten notes, raw, vivid, undeniable. Why didn't your previous lawyers bring this up? He asked. They said it wasn't necessary. Victoria replied, her voice heavy with fatigue. They said they had a better strategy. Daniel snapped the folder shut, his jaw tightening. Not using your most crucial evidence isn't a strategy. It's sabotage. Victoria's face went pale. You mean... your lawyers were paid to lose, Daniel said flatly. The only question now is who paid them. They worked until 3 in the morning, combing through every email, memo, and schematic. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. Key evidence ignored, vital witnesses never called, objections made at the worst times. It wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate. Victoria's former legal team hadn't failed her, they had sold her out. Is there anything you haven't told me? Daniel asked. Anything strange that's happened lately? Victoria hesitated. There is one thing. Julia Crane, my assistant, she copied some files onto a USB drive. Daniel's eyes narrowed. And you didn't question her? I trusted her. Julia's been with me for 5 years. In cases like this, Daniel said slowly, nothing happens by accident. If she copied those files, someone told her to. He looked directly at her, his tone firm. Tomorrow, no matter what I say or ask in court, don't react. No surprise, no correction. Everything's already part of the plan. Why? Because we're being watched, Daniel said quietly. Maybe not right this second, but somewhere, somehow. Assume every move we make is already known. A chill ran down Victoria's spine. You've been through this before, haven't you? Daniel stayed silent for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then finally he said softly, 15 years ago, I took a case against Titan Grid Energy Corporation. An engineer came forward about hidden safety violations. 3 workers died. I had the evidence. But before trial, it vanished from my office. Victoria held her breath. Daniel continued. They said I forged it, that I fabricated everything to hurt the company. I was suspended, then disbarred. It took me 4 years to prove my innocence. 4 years of odd jobs. 4 years of watching my daughter grow up without her father fully there. They destroyed you, Victoria whispered. They tried, Daniel said. But they didn't take the one thing that mattered: my knowledge of the law. And that's something they'll never take from you. When Daniel left at 4 a.m., the sky was still dark like spilled ink. Victoria stood by the window, watching the glow of his car fade into the distance. It wasn't the first time she'd felt alone in this fight, but for the first time in months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The next morning, Daniel walked into the courthouse wearing a thrift store suit he'd bought the night before. It wasn't new, and it wasn't stylish, but it was clean-pressed and respectable. $20 he could barely spare, but Judge Briggs had been right. Today he needed to look like a real lawyer. The courtroom was overflowing. The story of the janitor-turned-lawyer had swept through the city, and reporters filled every inch of space. When Daniel walked in, a few people even clapped, hesitant, unsure whether to cheer or scoff. He paid no attention. His focus was on one thing, only the truth. Rachel Monroe was ready. She wore a deep red power suit, her shoulders squared, eyes sharp, radiating the confidence of someone convinced the verdict was already hers. The prosecution calls Dr. Leonard Bryce, she announced. Dr. Bryce, a man in his 50s with wire-frame glasses and the polished composure of an academic, took the stand. For nearly 20 minutes, Monroe allowed him to paint a story in which he claimed to have created the core algorithms behind the quantum technology and that Victoria had stolen his work. Quantum core, he said, was where the idea truly began. Daniel sat motionless, taking notes, his face unreadable, but inside his mind the pieces were falling into place. The dates, the claims, the contradictions, none of it matched. When his turn came, Daniel rose holding a slim folder and walked to the lectern with a calm that drew the room into silence. Dr. Bryce, he began, his tone steady but controlled. You testified that you developed Quantum Core's primary algorithms between January and March of 2021. Correct. That's correct. Then help me clarify something. Daniel lifted a document. This is your employment record with Quantum Core. Would you please read your start date for the court? Bryce glanced down, color draining from his face. April 21st, 2021. I'm sorry, Daniel said quietly. Could you repeat that? April 21st. Bryce said louder, his voice shaking. Daniel turned toward the jury. So, you couldn't have developed those algorithms between January and March because you weren't employed yet. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel raised another document. And these are Quantum Core's server logs, showing the algorithms were finalized on March 15th, 2021, more than a month before you were hired. Would you like to explain how you contributed to a project that existed before you did? Objection, Monroe shouted. The prosecution was never provided this document, Your Honor. Daniel replied calmly. These records came directly from Quantum Core's system. If the prosecution failed to review available evidence, that's not my responsibility. Objection overruled, Judge Briggs said. Proceed. Bryce's hands trembled. Daniel fixed his gaze on him. Dr. Bryce, one last question. Did you receive a payment of $300,000 from Vertex Dynamics 2 weeks before testifying here today? Bryce froze. That's a yes or no, doctor. I was compensated for my time and expertise, he stammered. $300,000 for false testimony. Daniel's voice cut like steel. That sounds more like a bribe than compensation. The courtroom exploded in noise. Daniel turned back to the bench. Your Honor, I move to enter this payment as evidence and request that the witness be charged with perjury. Gasps, shouts, and the furious clatter of keyboards filled the room. The courtroom erupted like a live wire, and for the first time since the trial began, Daniel saw what he had been waiting for, fear in Rachel Monroe's eyes. They never imagined a janitor could dismantle their entire case. After the session, Daniel and Victoria stepped out of the courthouse into a sea of flashing cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted over one another, flashes bursting like lightning. Daniel kept his head low, resting a guiding hand on Victoria's back as he maneuvered her through the chaos. Only when the taxi door closed and the noise faded did Victoria finally exhale. "How did you know about the payment to Bryce?" she asked, still shaken. Daniel opened his old canvas briefcase, not leather, the kind bought from a thrift store. "I didn't know for sure," he said calmly. "But in cases like this, money always leaves a trail. I guessed, and the look in his eyes confirmed it." "You guessed?" Victoria stared at him astonished. "Almost," Daniel said with a slight shrug. "But once I saw his reaction, I had someone verify it." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. "My daughter Hannah, she works in digital marketing, but she's got a real talent for finding things online, since I told her about the case she's been digging." His phone buzzed a new text, lighting up the screen. "Dad, I found something big. Call me." Daniel looked up at Victoria. "We need to meet my daughter. Right now." An hour later, they sat in a small cafe in Astoria, a place that felt like another world to Victoria. The tables wobbled, plastic chairs squeaked, and the smell of burnt coffee mingled with old cooking oil. But it was quiet, private, and safe. No cameras, no reporters, no attorneys. Hannah Mercer walked in. Daniel stood abruptly awkward and unsure if he still had the right to hug her. Hannah made the first move, wrapping him in a quick, hesitant hug. But it was real. She was 20 with long brown hair and her father's steady eyes. Jeans, a plain t-shirt, an expensive laptop under her arm, and the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place. "Dad," she said, then turned to Victoria. "You must be Victoria Hale. I'm Hannah." They shook hands. Victoria couldn't help but notice the contrast, her own soft manicured hand meeting the calloused, work-worn grip of a young woman who built her life through effort, not privilege. Hannah flipped open her laptop. "Okay. At first I wasn't sure what Dad wanted me to look for, so I started with Vertex Dynamics," she said. "On the surface, they're spotless. A venture-backed tech firm with a clean corporate record." She scrolled through a stack of documents. "But when I traced the ownership structure, things got weird. Vertex is owned by a shell company in Delaware. That company is owned by another based in the Cayman Islands. And that one," Hannah paused, "is owned by Titan Grid Energy Corporation." Daniel froze. "Titan Grid Energy," he repeated quietly. "You know them?" Hannah asked. "Oh, I know them," Daniel said under his breath. "They're the company that ruined my career 15 years ago." Hannah stared, eyes wide. They had never really spoken openly about it, about who had been behind everything. "It was them," she whispered. Victoria leaned forward. "But why would an energy company care about my technology?" "At first I didn't understand either," Hannah said. "Then I read more about what you built." She turned her laptop so both Daniel and Victoria could see. "It's not just computing. If you can stabilize qubits at room temperature, the energy applications," she pulled up a scientific paper, "are groundbreaking." She pointed at a highlighted paragraph. "An MIT professor wrote that your work could revolutionize energy storage and conversion. It could make fossil fuels obsolete in 20 years. 20 years, Victoria repeated, each word heavier than the last. "And Titan Grid Energy makes $28 billion a year from coal, oil, and gas," Hannah said. "If your tech really works, they don't just lose profits, they lose everything." Daniel leaned back, realization settling over him. "That's why they didn't try to buy you out or compete," he said slowly. "They needed to erase you, your invention, your credibility." "There's more," Hannah added. "I kept digging. Titan Grid has financial links to 4 other major energy corporations, 2 defense contractors, and," she hesitated, 3 sitting members of the Energy and Commerce Committee. She scrolled through more files showing campaign donations, fundraisers, luxury trips. "They built a network, and when your technology appeared, they activated it." "What about the lawyers?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling. "How did they—" "I'm still tracing it," Hannah said. "But the managing partner at Bennett Shaw and Pierce sits on the board of a Titan Grid subsidiary. The details are buried deep, but they're there if you know where to look." Daniel stood and began pacing the cramped cafe, his thoughts racing to catch up. "So, this isn't just a lawsuit," he said. "This is a coordinated effort to protect a $1 trillion industry." And they won't stop, Victoria said, fear clear in her eyes. If they did this to you 15 years ago, if they can pull strings like this. She trailed off, but she didn't need to finish. They all understood. Hannah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. It's my old boss. He says I don't need to come back to work. They'll mail me my stuff. They fired you, Victoria asked. On paper, it's a position elimination, Hannah said bitterly. But the timing says it all. Daniel placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. I'm sorry, Hannah. I never wanted to drag you into this. Hannah looked up, her eyes steady. You didn't drag me into anything. I chose this, and now that I'm in, I'm helping you fight. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't see her as the little girl who had lost her mother, or the young woman he'd missed watching grow up. He saw something different, an ally, a partner. All right, he said, exhaling as if making a final decision. Then we do this together. In the days that followed, the threats stopped being distant fears and became real sharp reminders that made Daniel's stomach tighten each time he thought about them. His small apartment in Astoria was broken into. Nothing was stolen, there was nothing of value to take, but everything was trashed. The closet ripped open, drawers dumped on the floor, the mattress slashed with a deep cut, as if someone wanted to send a message. We know where you live. Hannah's laptop was hacked. Thankfully, she had backed up all her data on an encrypted cloud server, but knowing someone had deliberately targeted her sent a shiver down her spine. Then, one night, as Victoria was leaving her office late, a black SUV ran a red light and sped straight toward her car. Her driver swerved just in time, crashing into a light pole to avoid a head-on collision. Victoria escaped with scrapes and bruises, but the message was clear: she was a target. The next morning, during an emergency meeting at Victoria's estate, she said firmly, "You need to get out of your apartment. Daniel, Hannah. Both of you should move here where I have real security. We can't just live in your home like that," Daniel said, clearly uneasy. "I don't want to owe you anything." "This isn't a favor," Victoria interrupted. "It's a defensive move. They're attacking us separately. If we stay together with trained security, we're safer." Hannah touched her father's arm. "She's right, Dad. How am I supposed to work if I'm worrying about someone breaking in every night?" Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. That afternoon, they moved into the guest house on Victoria's property, a smaller separate building, but still larger than anywhere Daniel had ever lived. While Hannah explored the rooms with curiosity, Daniel stayed in the living room, sitting straight-backed but tense. The high ceilings, modern furniture, and expensive art made him feel out of place, like a smudge on a perfect canvas. He looked through the glass doors toward the neatly trimmed garden, barely able to believe that 48 hours earlier, he'd been in an apartment small enough that he could reach the kitchen sink from his bed. Victoria entered quietly and stopped beside him. "You're uncomfortable?" she said, not needing to ask. "I've spent 15 years in a small apartment," Daniel said quietly. "And this place, it's not my world." Victoria stood beside him in silence for a long moment, as if giving him space to take it all in. Then she spoke softly. "Maybe it should be your world. You have skill determination, Mr. Mercer. You could have been in a place like this or better if they hadn't taken everything from you." Daniel turned toward her, and for the first time since meeting in court, he truly saw her. Not as a client or a billionaire, but as a woman standing beside him in the same fight for justice. Her blue eyes, though tired, shone with something rare, sincere respect. "I don't need any of this," Daniel said firmly. "I never did. What I want is justice. I want to stand up for people who don't have a voice. And after all these years, I finally get to do that again. By helping me," Victoria said. "By fighting those who think money and power put them above the law," Daniel replied. They stood silently in the wide living room, as afternoon light streamed softly through the glass wall. The distance between their worlds, a janitor who once was a lawyer and a billionaire tech founder, was still there. But in that moment, it didn't feel impossible. Something had shifted, not because of words, but because they were standing side by side against the same enemy. And in that silence, they both understood. The real battle was just beginning. The next major breakthrough came from somewhere no one expected. At 2 a.m, Julia Crane, Victoria's longtime COO, appeared at the gate. Her face was pale clothes, wrinkled hair tousled, as if she'd been out all night. Security alerted Victoria immediately, and she hurried to wake Daniel. They met Julia in a small room separate from the main house, a precaution in case it was a setup. Julia nearly collapsed when she saw Victoria. Her mascara was streaked, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry," she blurted out. "I'm so sorry." "For what?" Victoria asked, her tone cold and sharp. Julia took a deep breath. "For everything. For copying the files, for feeding them information, for staying silent when I knew what they were doing to you." "Who are they?" Daniel asked. "Edward Sloan." Julia said hoarsely. "The CEO of Vertex Dynamics. He came to me 6 months ago. He knew about my mistake." "What mistake?" Victoria asked. Julia lowered her head, shame flooding her face. 10 years ago, before I worked for you, I was with another company. I embezzled $50,000. Not much, but still a crime. I paid it back and they didn't press charges. I thought it was over. But Sloan found out," Daniel said. Julia nodded, tears falling again. "He had everything: documents, emails, bank records. He said if I didn't help him, he'd turn me in. I'd go to prison." "So you helped him?" Victoria said, her voice flat. "I copied the data. I told him your strategies. Julia's voice cracked. "I even planted fake information in some files to make it look like you accessed Vertex research." "Fabricated evidence," Daniel said grimly. "Exactly what they once did to me." "Then why come here now?" Victoria asked, her gaze cold, but not without pity. Julia pulled a phone from her pocket, a sleek, expensive model that clearly wasn't hers. Daniel recognized it instantly. "This isn't your phone," he said. Today Julia began, her hands trembling. "I accidentally overheard Sloan on a call. He told someone to move forward with a permanent solution if the legal route failed." She swallowed hard. "They were talking about killing you, Victoria." The room went cold. "I know what I did was unforgivable," Julia continued, her voice shaking. "I betrayed you, but I can't live with this murder." She handed the phone to Daniel. "This is Sloan's phone. I took it from his office. It has everything: texts, emails, call recordings, the whole operation." Daniel took it, feeling like he was holding a live grenade. "This could end the case," he said quietly. "Or end us," Hannah said from the doorway. None of them had noticed her enter. "If they realize she took it, they'll come after her." "They'll know," Julia whispered. "Sloan will notice by morning, maybe sooner. That's why I came straight here." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. This woman had stood by her side for 5 years, through meetings, deadlines, endless nights, and now she was the one who had betrayed her. But in those tearful eyes, Victoria saw not just fear, but remorse. True, aching remorse. "You risked your own safety to come here," Victoria said, her voice softening for the first time. "I owe you more than that," Julia said, trembling. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You trusted me, and I broke that trust. This is the least I can do." Daniel didn't hesitate. "We need to copy everything on this phone right now. Hannah, can you handle it?" "Give me 15 minutes, Hannah said, already powering up her laptop. While she worked, Daniel turned to Julia. "You know they'll come for you, right?" Julia nodded. "You need to disappear, at least until this case is done." "I have a sister in Vancouver," Julia said quietly. "I can go there. Go now. Don't go home. Don't pack. Just go." 20 minutes later, all the data had been safely transferred to Hannah's encrypted server. In the dark, Julia left in a taxi, never looking back. Daniel watched the taillights fade until they disappeared, wondering if they were right to trust her, or if she'd survive the night. Victoria stood beside him, her voice low but steady. "She really is sorry." "Sorry doesn't undo the damage," Daniel said flatly. "No," Victoria agreed, "but courage can redeem it." She knew they'd retaliate and still came here. Daniel drew a deep breath, his jaw tightening with resolve. "Now we use what she gave us, and we move fast," Daniel said, glancing down at the phone in his hand, the living proof of a massive conspiracy. "Once they realize we have this, they'll come at us with everything they've got." They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, as Daniel, Hannah, and Victoria were reviewing every piece of evidence from Edward Sloan's phone, the estate's alarms blared through the intercom. "Breach at the main gate," the head of security reported. "Multiple armed intruders." Victoria jumped to her feet, locked down the property, and called the police. But when the camera feed switched angles, the truth was undeniable. 6 men in tactical gear, fully equipped, moving with precision and discipline. "They're not cops," Daniel said, his voice dropping. "Mercenaries," said Maddox, the security chief. "Ex-military or private contractors. They know what they're doing." "We have to get out," Hannah panicked. But the monitors showed 2 more vehicles blocking the back exit. No way out. Maddox, a former NYPD officer now leading Victoria's security detail, made the call instantly. "Safe room, now. Move." He led them through the house down to the basement, unlocking a steel door hidden behind a wine rack. Inside was a compact panic room with reinforced concrete wall surveillance screens and a direct line to 911. "You'll be safe here," Maddox said. "This door can take explosives. My team and I will hold them off as long as we can." "Police are on their way," Victoria said. "Earliest ETA is 15 minutes, Maddox replied. "We just have to survive 15. The door shut behind them with a metallic click. Inside the panic room, the 3 of them watched the security screens. The mercenaries moved like ghosts, precise and silent. Maddox and his team were already in defensive positions. "They're going to die," Hannah whispered, her hands trembling. "They're outgunned and outnumbered. Maddox knows how to fight," Victoria said, trying to sound calm though her voice wavered. Then the gunfire erupted. On the monitors, the battle played out like a silent nightmare. Maddox's team fought fiercely, using every corridor and blind spot. But the attackers were professionals, moving with lethal coordination. 1 guard fell, then a mercenary. But the intruders kept advancing. "They're heading for the basement," Daniel said. "They know we're here. How do they—" Victoria froze mid-sentence, her face going pale. "Julia. She must have told them about the safe room. Or they had the blueprints from the start," Hannah said quickly. "Either way, they know." Daniel scanned the room. 1 door, no windows, no alternate exit, no weapons. They were trapped inside a steel box, waiting to be cracked open. On the screen, one of the mercenaries placed a device on the basement door. "They're planting explosives," Hannah said, terror flooding her voice. Daniel grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "We're under attack at 247 Hudson Yard. Multiple armed suspects with explosives. We need immediate backup." "Nearest unit is 3 minutes away," the dispatcher replied. "Stay inside. 3 minutes, but the bomb would detonate in less than 1. Victoria clutched Daniel's hand. "If this is how it ends, it's not." He cut her off firmly. "We've come too far. It doesn't end like this." Just as the device began blinking seconds from detonation, something unexpected appeared on the monitors. Police cruisers, then more, followed by SWAT armored trucks, rolling in, not 1 or 2, but nearly a full strike team flooding the estate. The attackers saw it too. They hesitated, traded quick hand signals, and began retreating, vanishing as fast as they had arrived, leaving the explosive behind, still armed but untouched. "They're running!" Hannah gasped in disbelief. 10 minutes later, SWAT secured the grounds, disarmed the device, and swept every building. When the panic room door finally opened, Daniel, Victoria, and Hannah stepped out, pale but alive. A tall man in an FBI jacket was waiting, badge clipped to his belt. "Agent Blake Hollister," he said. "Ms. Hale, Mr. Mercer. I'm relieved you're safe." "How did you get here so fast?" Victoria asked. "We've been tracking Edward Sloan and his network for weeks," Hollister replied. "When a cab driver reported dropping off a woman matching Julia Crane's description near the Canadian border, we knew something big had broken. We mobilized immediately." "Is she safe?" Victoria asked quietly. "Julia's under federal protection in Canada," Hollister said. "She's agreed to testify in exchange for full immunity." Daniel exhaled the weight of years, finally easing off his chest. "So, we have enough to bring them down." "More than enough," Hollister said, a thin, restrained smile crossing his face. "Edward Sloan, 3 Atlantic Energy executives, and 6 accomplices are in custody as of an hour ago." With the data from his phone, Crane's testimony, and this attempted attack, he paused, his voice steady. "They're going to federal prison for a very long time." The next morning when Daniel entered the courtroom, the air was entirely different. Gone were the curious stares treating him as an oddity. In their place was quiet respect. Even the prosecutors looked hollow like soldiers after a lost war. Judge Matthew Rourke assigned, after Judge Fisk recused herself due to conflict of interest, struck the gavel. "I am aware of the major developments overnight," he said. Prosecutor Catherine Morris rose slowly, her voice subdued. "Your Honor, given the arrests and evidence submitted this morning, the prosecution formally moves to dismiss all charges against Ms. Hale." The courtroom erupted with noise as reporters shouted and cameras flashed like lightning. Daniel stayed seated, watching Morris with a strange mix of understanding and pity. She too had been used by forces far bigger than she could ever imagine. "The motion is granted," Judge Rourke announced. "Ms. Hale, you are free, and Mr. Mercer." He paused, his gaze resting on Daniel. "This court has never witnessed such an extraordinary act in the pursuit of justice. You deserve every honor that follows." As they stepped out of the courtroom, Victoria turned to Daniel, tears glimmering in her eyes. "We did it. We actually won." "You won," Daniel said gently. "You never gave up, even when everything looked lost." Hannah threw her arms around both of them, breaking the tension. "No, we won. As a team." 2 months later, Daniel stood outside a building on Fifth Avenue looking up at the new sign that read, "Mercer and Mercer Law, Civil Rights and Justice Advocacy." Hannah stood beside him, holding a brand new law textbook. After everything she'd witnessed, she had enrolled in law school, a decision born from the trial that had changed their lives. "You think we can really run this place?" she asked. "We can," Daniel said. "We already have our first 3 clients. People who were turned away because they couldn't afford an attorney." Hannah smiled. Thanks to the Hale Justice Initiative, Victoria had not only launched the fund with an initial $15 million, she had also rallied support from tech leaders across the country who had followed the case closely. The fund would sponsor civil rights lawsuits nationwide. As they walked into the still empty office, Daniel heard the sound of heels behind him. Victoria stood at the doorway holding a bottle of champagne. "I thought we should celebrate a little," she said, her warm smile lighting up the bare room. Hannah caught on immediately. "I'll go find some glasses." "Might take a minute," she said, slipping out and leaving Daniel and Victoria alone in the quiet office. They stood side by side in the soft afternoon light, filtering through the tall windows, the calm after a long storm. "I never properly thanked you," Victoria said softly, "for standing up that day, for believing in me when everyone else walked away." "You don't need to," Daniel replied. "You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. A purpose." Over the past 2 months, through press briefings, investigations, and the work of the foundation, something had shifted between them. It started as mutual respect grew into friendship, and now, standing here in the warm glow of light, it had become something deeper. "Daniel," she said, calling him by his first name for the first time. "I know we come from completely different worlds. I know people will talk. But I've realized something." "What's that?" he asked quietly. "That none of it matters," she said. "What people think doesn't matter. What truly matters is finding someone who understands you, stands beside you, and helps you become a better version of yourself." She paused, then whispered, "And I've found that person." Daniel's heart stopped. Since losing Sarah 15 years ago, he had never allowed himself to love again. He buried the grief, the hope, and the belief that he was worthy of another chance. But Victoria, who had seen past the janitor's uniform and the scars, had broken through every wall he had built. "I live a completely different life," Daniel said softly. "I don't have much, just integrity." Victoria cut in gently. "And courage, and kindness, and a heart that knows how to fight for what's right." She touched his hand. "I had wealth and success, but what I never had was someone who truly saw me." Daniel looked down at their hands, one soft and one rough, different yet fitting together effortlessly. "Sarah was the love of my youth," he said quietly. "I thought that part of my life was over. But maybe we get more than one chance," Victoria said, her voice barely a breath. "If we're brave enough to take it," Daniel answered. They stood there in a silence so tender it felt like time itself had stopped. Then Daniel leaned in slowly, gently, and kissed her. It wasn't passion. It was a promise between two people who had been broken, who had lost everything, yet still found the strength to believe again. I can't find any glasses. We might need to buy some. Hannah's voice suddenly called from the back. Daniel and Victoria burst into laughter, the quiet moment melting into warmth. Come on, Victoria, said, taking his hand. Let's show your daughter her new office. Maybe tonight the three of us can go out to dinner. I'd like that, Daniel said. Before leaving, he turned back to the door and looked once more at the sign, Mercer and Mercer Law, a new beginning, a second chance. No, he corrected himself silently, a second life. Daniel Mercer's story reminds us that it's never too late to start again. That justice isn't defined by wealth or title, but by courage and the will to stand for what's right. That heroes can come in many forms, sometimes wearing work gloves instead of expensive suits. His story proves failure isn't the end, that betrayal can be healed, and that even after great loss, love can still return. Most of all, Daniel shows that each of us has the power to rise to speak and to fight for what's right, no matter who tries to silence us. If you were in Daniel's shoes, what would you choose? A stable, high-paying corporate job, or a new path fighting for those without a voice? Share your thoughts below. And if this story of courage and justice inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss more true stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that one person standing up for what's right can still change the world. Thank you for watching. I will protect her. And remember, justice doesn't always wear an expensive suit, and love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Never lose hope. Never stop fighting. And never underestimate the power of one good person with the courage to stand tall. I'll protect her. And remember, justice doesn't always wear a designer suit, and love can appear in the most unexpected places. Never give up hope. Never stop fighting.